Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. If you've not joined us for one of these live podcasts or live webinars before, my name is Gary Stringer. I am the host of a podcast called L&D Disrupt, and I'm also the content marketing manager at How Now. I'm joined by our CEO, Nelson Sivalingham, who I'm going to get to introduce himself and what How Now do in a second. But excitingly, I want to tell you first about the 2024 L&D Trends Report, which will form a lot of the data points we're going to talk about today, help us navigate the discussion. And essentially, this is a free guide that you can download where we have taken more than 20 reports from the likes of CIPD, Gallup, Lattice, AppSpace, BetterWorks, Slack, and more to give you realistic and unbiased L&D trends, all backed by the latest data. And essentially, the guide will give you a top-level summary of the trending point, explains how we got there, and gives you 2 or 3 practical recommendations for each trend. So if you like what you hear today and you're looking for more insights and more practical takeaways, then definitely head over and use the guide. And the link to that will be in the chat shortly. And without further ado, Nelson, if you want to tell us who you are and what How Now do before we dive into these 5 trends.
Yeah, Gary, thanks for having me back on the pod. It feels like it's been a while, but I'm Nelson, one of the founders and the CEO at How Now. And at How Now, we essentially help companies where they feel learning is coming across like an unwanted interruption. We help them go from there to making learning more of an integrated part of everyday work. We help them do that by giving them the technology to connect the right learning to the right person at the right time, which helps people engage in relevant learning, build the skills they need, and grow in their career. I'm also the author of Learning at Speed, which essentially borrows from my last kind of 15 years of being an entrepreneur and adapts the mental models and frameworks from the world of building a startup and applying it to the world of L&D and how we can accelerate the speed at which we learn within our organization. So yeah, I'm really excited for what's ahead.
Yeah, timely for you to say that, Nelson, because Laura actually just mentioned that she said Learning at Speed has really helped her drive their strategy and engage their employees. So really nice to hear that. And actually,
thanks, Laura.
Yeah, some of the frameworks from the book are actually downloadable through the guide as well, because they really relate to some of the issues we're going to dive into today. And the first one of those actually is quite timely, given what you said about organizations and helping them move away from this content-led and be more skills first. But the first trend is that L&D needs to get closer to organizational goals to drive impact. To give you a bit more context on that, Nelson, basically, we often hear that L&D teams want to drive more impact, but the data shows that in reality, we're probably getting further away from that point. So according to CIPD's Learning at Work report, between 2021 and 2023, the number of L&D teams who said they were aligned to the organizational and people priorities dropped from 77% to 67%. So a 10 percentage point drop in the space of just 2 years. So I guess, first of all, why do you think we're going backwards a little bit in terms of our alignment to the wider organization?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite sad to see the drop. And I think there's another story that came out earlier in the week, which I think captures the problem at play quite well, which was a recent study that shows 84% of employees expect learning as a benefit, yet 51% of C-suite execs, quote, think it's a waste of time. So that really tells you where the kind of disconnect is and why is there this internal perception that L&D is essentially a waste of time. And I think it comes down to there's been obviously a lot of changes in the way we work. And speaking to L&D teams, I've almost seen that they're still adapting to the hybrid workforce or a remote first workforce, and how do we tackle that? There's been a lot of changes with recent redundancies and layoffs, and you're almost constantly jumping from one fire to another. And when you're kind of caught between that environment, you almost go back to doing, what I was doing in a classroom. Let me just quickly put that online and kind of hope for debate. I just need to be seen to be doing something. I need to be putting output out there. And so I had a lot of conversation with L&D professionals who, they're great thinkers and have a very progressive outlook, but they're almost under pressure to tick the box. And, a lot of them have said to me, I don't believe in bringing in a content library with millions of pieces of content, but I almost feel like I have to do it just so the business sees that we're doing something from an L&D perspective. So I think almost under the pressure, we're kind of leaning on doing the easiest things to do rather than the things that are going to have the biggest impact. And that's kind of actually making the problem worse, because the company looks at it and thinks you're not adding any value, and therefore we're either going to cut your budget or we're going to push your budget. And I think that's why we've seen that kind of 10% drop.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The short-termism, maybe that doing something visible in the short term means that in the long term, I'll have some sort of impact or I'll preserve my status and buy-in. But you're completely right, because a byproduct of that disconnect was that in the data, there were similar declines in the number of L&D teams who had clarity and where they add value, and also the number of business leaders who recognized L&D's impact on their business priorities. So you're right that the visibility might stave off maybe an issue in the sort of short term, but the longer term thing is that we need to be kind of more sustainable or strategic in how we add value over time. I guess another follow-up question to that, Nelson, is people will see in the guide as well, there was a stat from LinkedIn's workplace learning report that 6 of L&D's top 12 success measures could be classed as vanity metrics. So they were just things like time spent on learning, number of courses completed, which I think really speaks to your point about showing impact, not necessarily in the wrong ways, but through the right ways, but through this output kind of mindset.
Yeah, I think the reality is, and what you can see from those vanity metrics, is we're still not speaking the language of the business, right? We're not speaking to our audience. We're very much speaking in a language that we understand, but we don't seem to be concerned that the person this message is for is not really getting it. And what I mean by that is we still very much talk about content. Everything we talk about is very content centric. It's we're talking about completion rates, we're talking about time spent learning, and the reality is your C-suite and the employees don't care about content and content completion. They don't really care how many courses they completed, because that's not going to help them perform better at their job. It's not going to help them grow in their career. And so we really need to drop talking about things that are important to us. And kind of side note is, should it be important to us, whether they did content or not? But actually start talking about what's important to them. And it really goes back to this core question of what's in it for me. And often we might think about what's in it for the employees, but are we really asking the question of what's in it for the business? Why should the business invest time, money, and effort into this? And I think to answer that question, we need to start using the common language the business understands. And we believe that is skills, right? Skills is the language that the business understands, right? The C-suite understand if you told them, we don't have these skills, therefore we need to do X, Y, Z to build those skills. They understand that. Employees understand it when you tell them you don't right now have the skills to be able to progress onto this next step. And we understand skills as L&D. We understand why the business needs these skills. And so it's a language that everyone understands. And it allows us to be able to identify the problems, communicate our impact in a language they understand. And that's why we kind of recommend shifting from a very content-first approach to L&D to a skills-first approach to L&D. And an example of a company that's done this successfully is, Deloitte recently shared data that they switched from very kind of content-first learning to a very skills-first approach to the way they tackle learning. And they saw a 37% increase in employee retention. Why? Because what employees want to know is, are they building the skills they need to be able to progress in their career? And the reality is, you talking about content completion and time spent learning doesn't answer the question they need answer to. And skills allows us to align directly to the business objectives, because we can look at the business objectives and ask the question of, does the business have the skills required to achieve that business objective? What are the skills that are missing? And now let me align that learning to the skills that we need to bridge the gap for. And that way it helps me tie it directly back to those business objectives. And that's what we're not doing enough of. And we're still focused on content. How can I build the most amount of content? How can I procure the most amount of content? And actually, that's not going to bode well for L&D in the future.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I come from marketing, which is the land of never-ending vanity metrics. But, the performance of the content, that those metrics are just an indication of how the content performed, but they're not, like you say, they're not linked to someone's role, what they're trying to do on a day-to-day basis. So you can only take a very narrow view of something like the performance of a piece of content because it happens in isolation. Whereas, like you said, if we move to thinking about skills, then we are going to by default start talking more about the business and the wider team as opposed to has person A completed course B.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes down to, if you ask the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong answer. And right now we're asking the wrong question. The question we're asking right now is, what content does this person need, and how am I going to get this content to them? But actually, the question we should be asking is, what skills does this person need, and how am I going to help them build those skills? And if we reframe those questions, we're likely to end up closer to the right answers, and they're the answers the business cares about.
And to give people, again, more tangible tactics they can maybe apply. I think when you talked about understanding problems, this is a good way to understand the skills needed, because sometimes what happens is people don't go through the problem discovery stage to the extent to truly understand a problem. And I don't think if you understand a problem in its full detail, you can know what skills are needed to solve it. So any advice on how people can do that problem discovery process a bit more effectively to get them closer to that skills mindset?
Absolutely. I think immediately what you can do is, there's probably many of us on this session that have at some point done a training needs or a learning content needs analysis. Now, the problem with that is it's a lagging indicator. And you're also asking your internal customer to diagnose themselves and prescribe themselves with the medication that they need, saying, I think I need a training course in X. And actually, by that time, the problem could have passed. But also, that's L&D's expertise, is to help them diagnose and then help them find the right solution to that problem. And that's why we need to shift to, rather than looking at training needs, is looking at the skills inside the organization. And that's a proactive way of measuring skills. So if you aren't measuring skills, that's the first thing I'd recommend you start looking at, is how do we figure out, what skills we have and don't have within the organization, so we can proactively start to monitor where the gaps are in the organization aligned to our business objectives, and we can proactively look at sourcing solutions to bridge those gaps rather than reactively responding to training needs. So that's a good way of, really going down to the problem rather than, it's like the classic 5 whys. And right now we're stopping at the first one, where someone's going, I need a training course because my sales team is underperforming. I go, why are they underperforming? And when you ask those 5 whys, we'll end up in a position where we find out actually the skill they're lacking is product knowledge, or the skill they're lacking is negotiation skills. But if we were monitoring that proactively, we could have acted on it.
No, it makes perfect sense. And I think actually it makes sense to jump forward a little bit in our running order, Nelson, to discuss this shift from hiring to upskilling, which is another trend we wanted to discuss, because so much of that links to this. But, the context for that is that we're in a world now where there's 6 open roles for every qualified person. And the harsh truth is that you can't simply fill every skill gap by hiring people externally. What's interesting is that Udemy's top 7 surging skills, which means the ones that saw the highest increase in content consumption, were recruitment and hiring in workplace and human resources. Now, of course, if it is a more crowded space, you will need the skills of hiring effectively. But to put all your eggs in the I'm going to hire basket, or just to focus my skill development on hiring, seems a little bit short-sighted. So I guess, what are your thoughts in general on the talent shortage, but also why is upskilling and a focus on maybe internal mobility a more sustainable option?
Yeah, and I think to that point that you just mentioned, Gary, about recruitment and why are so many people looking at recruitment courses, etc., is somewhat a sunk cost fallacy, right? If you've just built out a talent acquisition team, and now you've come into a market where there is a talent shortage, you've kind of sunk the cost on the talent acquisition team, and you're like, well, I've got this overhead, I need them to work. And so in this tight labor market, they're like, I need to figure out a way of making sure I'm getting return on investment on this talent acquisition spend that I've already sunk. But it's not unheard of. There are many companies where they've kind of either redeployed that talent acquisition team to other parts of the HR. But kind of going to the macro picture, like you said, Gary, what we're seeing and it's kind of taken us by surprise because this has never happened before. We're typically in a tight economic market. What we also tend to see is high unemployment rates, right? Because companies are making redundancies, they don't have the budget to be able to hire people. So we end up seeing a higher unemployment rate. Now, that hasn't happened. Although we are in a tight economic market, actually what we're seeing is some of the highest demands for talent that we've ever seen in the last 50 years. And this is across the globe. Now, what that tells us is our biggest problem isn't actually, robots taking over all of our jobs. Our biggest problem is there aren't enough skilled people to fill the roles that we're looking for, right? Now, at that point, what that means is the labor market becomes very competitive and very expensive. Now, if you combine that with the fact that the rate of change is so fast and you're going to constantly need new skills or redeploy the people inside your organization, it's just not sustainable for a business to keep spending money to buy talent every time they need to bridge a skills gap. And therefore, a superpower that a business needs to build in order to be able to win the talent war is the ability to be able to build those skills in-house, right? Now, it's not just important to do that to avoid the expensive cost of hiring externally. It's also important to do that because if you don't, your best talent is going to leave the organization. Now, why are they going to leave the organization? Because it's such a great job market, right? And now is the best time for the people with the right skills. If you're not supporting their career growth, they can keep walking until they find a company that is going to support their growth. And so because there's so much opportunity out there, it really puts the pressure on companies to help them build the skills they need to grow in their career. And growth starts with, like you mentioned, Gary, talent mobility is where we kind of finish with growth, is helping them find a relevant role. But if you work backwards from that, in order to support employee growth, we need to help them build the skills they need. And in order to help them build the skills they need, we need to make sure they're engaging in relevant learning. So it does all start with engaging in learning in order to drive talent mobility and career growth.
Yeah, and what's even more worrying, to your point, if they don't find it internally, they'll go and find it elsewhere. The survey you mentioned right at the start that came out yesterday, I read the full thing, and what's even worse is that if people aren't getting internally, they'll pay out of their own pocket to build the skills they need, which is really interesting. So I got the stat in front of me, but in the last 12 months, the majority of employees, 57% paid for external learning content out of their own pocket. So like you said, you need the skills internally. The people are telling you they need it. And if they're not getting it from you, either they'll go and find it somewhere else or they'll upskill themselves to the point where they're ready to future-proof themselves. But it's a bit of a sad state of affairs for reading the full data on that, because the biggest thing I took away is a third of people said they were overwhelmed when thinking about the change in skills requirements. And a third of people don't feel they have the skills needed for their future roles. So, not even from like a business perspective, but from how happy are your people? Do they feel they've got job security? How engaged are they at work because they know they've got the right skills versus they're worrying about whether they're going to be redundant? So as well as all these kind of business benefits, there's a big people benefit to making sure you're focusing on people's skills.
Absolutely. And I think hearing those data points, Gary, that you just shared, and I can see in the chat, Amber, you've asked for the survey. We'll drop the link in the chat for you to see. L&D should really be asking themselves some serious questions here, right? Like, how can it be that we've got to a situation where employees are spending outside of the organization to build their skills to go elsewhere? Another data point, which many of you may have seen, but McKinsey found that only 12% of employees reported using any of the skills they got from internal L&D. Now, what that shows is a lot of wastage, right? That means 88% of people didn't acquire any relevant skills as a result of what was on offer from an L&D perspective inside the organization. And so this really we need to ask ourselves as L&D about our purpose and about, are we actually delivering impact or not if this is the state of affair? Like, the days of just being able to do compliance and that is sufficient are well and truly gone, right? That there are now self-service solutions for compliance. I mean, compliance can in essence run itself, especially with AI combining with compliance learning content. And so it will become very difficult for L&D functions that are dependent on running compliance to really justify their place and spend within the organization. And we really need to move beyond that in the maturity scale to be able to add meaningful value to the company.
And it's also worrying if you think about justifying spend or showing ROI. If a bunch of people who are leaving your company said, well, we didn't get the skills we needed, so we paid out of our own pocket to upskill in this thing, and then we decided to leave the company because now we have the skills plus we can get an opportunity elsewhere. That is I would be worried if I was kind of hearing that. I know we get stuck in the sort of number-based metrics when we discuss about ROI, but actually if you think about if that many people were paying out of their own pocket, imagine if the volume of noise, if that many people were through their feedback mechanisms going, look, the stuff you're giving me doesn't help, like you said to that McKinsey stat.
I mean, I would even flip it from ROI to talking about COI, which is the cost of inaction, right? Is by not doing anything and not helping your people build the skills they need. In essence, what you're saying is your best talent are leaving. Now, we can put a cost to that, right? There's the cost of missed opportunity, right? That you now have an empty seat where you could be getting a certain amount of productivity, but you're not because that talent has left the building. There's the cost of knowledge loss. Now, that talent takes with them all the great stuff they've learned as a part of the company, which now you need to be able to relearn. But also the cost of replacement. In a competitive job market, it's now going to be expensive for you to find a replacement. Now, you combine that cost of not doing anything versus the cost of getting a solution in place to solve that problem, the cost of the solution is going to be a fraction. So when you're thinking about building a business case internally, many L&D professionals tell me they sometimes find it hard to build an ROI story. Well, what I recommend at this time to get your business case through the organization is to talk about the cost of inaction. If the business doesn't do anything about this, what is the cost to the business? And if that's significantly more expensive than the cost of doing something about it, then you have your business case.
No, it makes sense. And I want to just remind people they can download the guide, which kind of breaks this down in more detail, gives you some recommendations for conducting a skills audit and working out which skills you have and need, because obviously we covered a lot of ground there. So I want to make sure people know that the sort of you can digest that at your own pace in the guide as well. But I guess another thing, Nelson, as well, we did talk a bit about the shift from content first to skills first, but I did want to come back to that because we talked about being aligned to the organizational goals, and learning that has impact either solves a problem for a person or a team, which we kind of covered, or it plugs a skills gap so we get closer to the organizational goals. And when the content is created first for the sake of it, that is really unlikely to happen, or both of those things are unlikely to happen. So yeah, maybe just expand a little bit on that content first to skills first, and what it means and why it matters and what the sort of advice is for doing it.
Yeah, so when you take a content first approach, what you're essentially doing is ignoring the context in which this content is going to exist and be delivered, etc. And content without context is the best way to push out the wrong content to the wrong person at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. When that many things are wrong, you can't really get a lot right. And that ends up in a situation where you don't get the engagement. We call this the engagement gap, where if you've ever been in a position where you've spent a manager came to you, they asked you for a training program or course. You spent the next few months building out the most perfect training program with beautiful looking animations, a workbook, a survey, all of those things. And on one fine day, you push it out and actually only a handful of people engage with it and they don't really complete it. The rest of the people don't engage with it. So you're sending out email chasers to get them. Like if you've ever gone through that, and I imagine most people on this session have, that's the engagement gap, right? People don't see the value in it for them because we didn't start with that. We didn't start with the problem. We didn't start with the skills that we're trying to build. Instead, we started with someone who said, I needed this particular content. And content really isn't the problem, right? We're living in a post-content world where content is cheap and abundant. And when content is cheap and abundant, the biggest challenge, right? The biggest challenge is discovery, right? Let's use a consumer example. If you take something like Spotify's problem isn't that there aren't enough songs in the world. That's not the reason why they're going into audiobooks, etc. In fact, their biggest problem is, how do they find a song I've never heard of and recommend it to me to suit my taste? Like it's the discovery is the hardest challenge. And that's, you take any content platform, discovery is the hardest challenge to solve. And that's true for L&D, right? There's so much learning out there that, as you mentioned in your previous example, Gary, people will go find learning themselves. And if it costs money, they'll pay for it themselves. But the challenge is they're having to put a lot of time and effort into finding that relevant learning. And that's really where L&D can help. L&D can help map this learning ecosystem back to the skills that you're trying to build and make it easier for someone to be able to find the most relevant learning that's going to help them build the skills they need to progress in their career. So that's an example of how taking a skills-first approach changes the way L&D can kind of approach the way we implement L&D within the organization.
Perfect. And I guess before we move on, it will be remiss of us not to talk about how people can measure skills. So obviously a lot of what we spoke about depends on people being able to measure the skills they do have in their business before they can work out the gaps they have and don't have. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, Nelson, and also maybe it's a good time to sort of explain to people how we do that at How Now, because actually that's a really effective sort of approach that's being used by our customers.
Yeah, I can definitely share some best practices of how our customers are using How Now to do that. And we've got many organizations that we work with, all the way from your kind of small companies with a couple of hundred people, all the way up to, companies with over 100,000 people, who are all on the journey to become a skills-based organization and really look at their company from the skills lens. And a key part of becoming a skills-based organization is to know what skills you have and don't have. And how companies use How Now to do that is, the first thing is the skills mapping, right? So the first challenge to overcome is you need to know what skills should each individual have based on their job role, based on their experience. And this is where we have a large language model based of real-time job market data. So we collect and analyze millions and millions of job adverts to identify what the most in-demand skills are for any particular job. We then combine that with your internal talent data that lives in your HR system, which tells us, what jobs has this person done? What level of experience do they have? Now, we combine that internal talent data with external job market data to essentially build a mapping for every individual. So we're able to tell you, this individual, these are the skills they should have. And it doesn't stop there, but to also be able to tell you, this is the skill level they should have for that particular job role. Now that you know where they should be, you need to know where they are. And this is where we have a built-in 360 assessment tool, where we combine self-assessment, peer assessment, and manager assessment to give every individual an average proficiency score for the skill they have. Now, very quickly in those two steps, you now have quantitative data. You have a numerical value for the skills that you have in your business, which make it easier for you to identify your strengths, and also easy for you to identify the skills gaps in your business. And that helps you identify those gaps that you need to work on. And now you can start to build your L&D strategy really aligned to those gaps that you've identified. And this is how a lot of our customers approach their L&D strategy, is by using this skills data they get from How Now.
Perfect. Thanks, Nelson. I think it makes sense as well, actually, to just discuss this third trend around time and engagement still somehow by a miracle for the millionth year in a row being the biggest barriers to learning. Because I've only been in this space for like 4 or so years, but every year when I read these reports, it's still time and engagement are the biggest barriers to learning. And that was in the CIPD Learning at Workplace work report as well, because people name those, more than 40% name those as their biggest barriers to supporting the organizational and the people goals. We kind of already talked through the problem of the content first approach, kind of dragging people out of the workflow, making it hard for them to learn things that feel relevant and related to the job they're doing. But how do we bring learning into the flow of work? Because in the flow of work is when we have a real problem to solve. We're motivated to learn. We can actually apply what we learn. And if we apply it, we influence performance. So just curious to get your thoughts on how we break down time and engagement being a barrier by bringing learning to the flow of work.
Yeah, and I think I'm always amazed whenever I see this as a reason for a lack of engagement. And I think it's important for us to understand what this data tells us. Employees are not saying they don't have the time to learn. Because as your previous data shared, Gary, people are learning outside of work. We all are, right? Everyone on this session, you've tuned into a webinar because you want to learn, right? You're listening to podcasts, you're reading blogs, all because you want to learn. And that's exactly what every other employee within the company is doing. What that data tells us is employees are saying they don't have time to learn for the sake of learning. They don't have time to learn the things that you think are important, but you've not told me why it's important. That's what they're telling us. They just haven't got the time to learn because you say it's important. And they want to understand what's in it for them. And so there's a couple of different ways. There's the kind of strategic ways of solving this problem combined with a technical way of solving this problem. And I want to start with the strategic things you can do. Now, if you don't have manager and leadership buy-in in your organization, it's very difficult for you to be able to deliver learning in the flow of work. Because learning in the flow of work means we're essentially identifying opportunities in someone's day-to-day. We're giving them the space to be able to practice things that they learn in a safe space where they feel like they're not going to get serious repercussions for getting it wrong. Instead, they're going to get the right level of feedback to improve and iterate on what they've learned. Now, that can only happen with the right environment and conditions set by the leadership and managers. That can only happen if you have manager and leadership buy-in around, sometimes we hear pushback around giving people access to learning, where managers are worried that what if someone sat there learning all day and not doing their work? Now, that's the wrong mindset to be able to have, right? If you've got the right performance metrics in place and you're measuring and managing someone's performance in an effective way, you can avoid that situation. And so it just comes to a lack of buy-in from managers and leaders around the importance of what a skills-first approach to learning can do. So I think that's the first hurdle to overcome. The second one is really thinking about how we market L&D, right? L&D within an organization, in essence, is a consumer product, right? Because every employee is a consumer. So we need to really think about ourselves as a consumer brand that exists within the organization. Now, like many successful consumer products, we need to clearly articulate, A, what the problem is, right? The employee is not going to engage unless they're problem aware, right? Because if they're not aware a problem exists, then they have no motivation to seek out a solution. So the first rule of marketing for L&D is for us to help employees become problem aware, get them to understand, you're right, this skills gap does exist. And because of this skills gap, this is the impact on my performance. Now that we've made them problem aware, we do the second part, which is to tell them the solution. And now that isn't enough to blast out one email and say, look, I told you we've got these resources. Why didn't you do anything about it? We need to look at other ways of doing this. Like influencer marketing is a great way of doing it. There are influencers within every organization. If you don't know who they are, figure out who they are and leverage their influence to get them to talk about the positive impacts and success of relevant learning on building those skills. So that's the second thing I'll talk about. In order for you to embed learning in the flow of work, you need to really focus on how you market it. Now, from a technology perspective, what you need to look at is right now, your traditional LMSs, what they do is they drag people from the tools and apps where they work, and they drag them into an LMS. But the reality is, most of us don't work inside of LMS. I mean, even L&D people don't spend their entire day inside an LMS. And so instead of dragging people in LMS, what we need to do is take the learning and knowledge into the tools and apps and systems where people work. So they don't have to switch context, where they're able to immediately on demand access relevant learning within the apps and tools where they work. And if your learning platform isn't doing that for you, then you should really ask. That's probably adding another barrier and more friction for people to be able to access relevant learning. And that's the kind of tech stack you need in place to be able to reduce the friction for people to be able to access learning in the flow of work.
Yeah, it's the perfect segue, because the next trend actually is that people are really struggling to find information they need. So almost a third of employees are waiting days or longer for vital information. And more than half have been unable to find digital documents, because people can't learn from what they can't find. Like you said, discovery is an issue. And like you said, most of the time it's because resources are scattered in too many places. It's not at the end of one search. So the reason people waiting so long for information is because when they search, they don't find it. So they have to ask someone, and then they're at the kind of behest of that person's schedule for how long they can reply. And most people are searching because they've got a real pressing need. Like if I can't add people to the system and there's like 100 new customers to add to the system, I can't wait days for someone to reply on Slack about how to do it. So yeah, first of all, I guess, Nelson, what are your thoughts on why is this happening, and why is it so damaging that everything's scattered and no one can find it?
Yeah, I mean, I saw that survey as well. I think it's by AppSpace, and it amazed me that, just imagine that, like how much that's slowing down productivity if for every information or knowledge request you're having to wait days to get that information back. And I think a big part of this is actually a hangover from our shift from being full-time in the office to very quickly moving to remote and hybrid. And the reality is a lot of organizations just didn't have the infrastructure to be able to enable working hybrid and remotely, right? It's the classic case of a lot of companies didn't have knowledge captured and centralized, and they were just so used to spinning on their chair and asking the person next to them, and they got used to that kind of asking my manager or asking my peer a question as and when I need it. And the moment you started working remotely or hybrid, what happens is that turns into basically annoying interruptions on Slack and Teams, right? And you start to become aware of that virtual shoulder tap is basically very inefficient and quite annoying after a certain point if the same person is getting asked the same question over and over again. So it's just a reality that a lot of companies weren't prepared for this. And so where we need to move to be able to address this is really looking at building a search first culture around how we think about knowledge and learning. And it's this idea that we capture and bring together all of our learning and knowledge and skills into a single searchable place. Like, for example, our customers, we have integrations with Slack and Teams, and some of the best use cases I've seen is, right now we transfer a lot of knowledge on Slack, right? I ask you a question, Gary, you answer that question. That answer gets lost in a stream of conversation. Someone else is going to ask you that same question on Slack, and you're stuck. You're having to answer it again. But we've seen our customers use How Now to capture that answer and turn it into a nugget that gets saved in How Now. Now, what that means is the next time someone needs that answer, instead of coming to you, Gary, you're now building a search first culture where you search first. And if you don't find the answer, now you ask. And so that really comes to a broader question of, do you have a single front door to all of your learning and knowledge? And most often teams that we see don't have that, right? They're having to go to 10 different places to find the learning and knowledge they need. SharePoint, OneDrive, LMS, third-party content library. And that's just some of the internal sources. Then you've got external publication. Now, just imagine the amount of friction and effort that will take. And the reality is we're all busy. And if there's too much friction, we try once and then we're like, nah, you know what, it's too hard. Either that or L&D are getting the question of, where do I find this again? And as an L&D professional, do you really want to sit there with your job being that person who kind of gives you directions to finding things? And so I think the problem we need to overcome is there's a big, diverse learning and knowledge ecosystem out there. And we need the right technology to bring that together to create that single front door to all of our learning, knowledge, and skills.
The data from the rest of that AppSpace report really supports that as well, because people's biggest bugbear was that their tech didn't speak to each other, or they were using too many tools in the company. And actually a lot of, I think it was 67% said they weren't completely satisfied with their current workplace tools, and 35% want to use less tools in their workplace. And I guess part of it is, like you said, sometimes we take a very short view of what legacy tech means, like, oh, it's like a tool from 20 years ago. But like you said, if you were using it 5 years ago and it doesn't work for you anymore, then it is legacy tech because it doesn't solve your current problems. And that's the perfect example. You know, all these scattered things worked when we were in the office together and I could ask you, but now we've got people working in different time zones, different locations, different hours. We can't have this repeat question thing that interrupts people's day.
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. And I think what hybrid and remote work has accelerated is the consumerization of work tech, right? Is we're at home using consumer products whilst also using work products, right? And so now the comparison is happening in real time, right? I'm going from an app I'm using in my personal life to the app I'm using at work. And now the kind of discrepancy and the gap between the two bits of tech is even more in your face. And naturally, people are going to push back saying, why can't it be as easy to use as the things I use in my personal life? And we're going to hear more demands from employees, and rightly so. And this does really force us to ask questions around, is the tech that we have right? And I completely agree with your point. It's legacy tech if it's no longer solving your problem.
No, exactly. And then I guess I'm conscious of time, but there was this interesting stat from Slack that said there was just this huge amount of people who feel pressured to be online all the time. And this isn't helping, like 53% of desk workers feel pressured to respond quickly, even if the messages are sent after their working hours. 63% make an effort to keep their status online, even if it's outside working hours. So if you think this is just bad from people's performance perspective, it's also bad from a cultural perspective and people's, work-life balance perspective. Because if you're always on because it's not saved in one place, imagine how much stress you could save for people as well. Cool. We're coming to the fifth trend. I'll remind people that we do want to take some time to answer questions at the end, so drop them in the Q&A if you haven't already. But our last trend, Nelson, has to be AI. I'm sure people had their bingo cards ready because we hadn't discussed it yet. But in the report, people will see this kind of mantra that to drive impact, AI needs to be used more intentionally. And I think that's part of the problem at the moment between the hype or the fear of getting left behind or the novelty of it. I think people are missing that step of they're putting the cart before the horse because they're using AI to create before working out actually what problems it solves. And just love to get your thoughts on how AI is currently being used in L&D.
Yeah, I think maybe a bit of context setting to start with. I mean, one of the most common questions I get asked is this hype for real? Is this one of those metaverse style hypes, or is AI really going to change the way we work? And I mean, the short answer for that is it is really going to change the way we work. And to kind of give you a picture of why, I mean, AI isn't new, right? We've now been using AI since we started over the last kind of seven years. But AI isn't new. But I do want to say what the fundamental shift has happened. If you look at the way AI algorithms operated, even 3 or 4 years ago, is essentially AI was the equivalent of a human with a very short attention span, right? So it could only really look at one thing at a time. So if we were using AI to translate a sentence, it would have to look at one word at a time. It couldn't look at all the words in parallel and understand the overall context. So it was a human with a very short attention span and a short memory. Now, with the new transformer model, which is the T in GPT, what that allows us to do is we now have the equivalent of a human that has a very big attention span and almost a never-ending memory. And what that means is we're now able to look at things in parallel, understand the context, retain the context, and apply it in future scenarios. So this is really a paradigm shift, and I think that's why it's taken over the global consciousness. Now, that doesn't mean the fundamentals change, right? It's like any other technology breakthrough we've seen prior to this, right? The tech helps us solve the problem, but it still means we need to start with the fundamentals of defining the problem and really making sure we're working on the right problem. And there's an incredible stat that McKinsey actually in a recent study showed that they've seen at least 56% adoption of AI in at least one business function. Yet only a fraction showed any financial benefits. So all of this story around, productivity gains, cutting costs, improving profits, actually, we're not seeing a lot of that. Now, what that says is people are really excited to use this shiny new toy. And that's great. We should play with shiny new toys and, it kind of inspires us and sparks our imagination. But that doesn't change the fact that unless you apply this new technology for a relevant problem, we're not actually going to see meaningful benefits. And that's where it kind of goes back to content first, right? A lot of the use cases we're seeing for AI right now in L&D is to create content faster and cheaper. Now, content, like I mentioned before, is never the problem. If you had the wrong L&D strategy in place, what you end up doing is pushing the wrong content to the wrong person at the wrong time. Now, imagine you still had the wrong strategy in place, but now you can create that wrong content faster and cheaper. All you're doing is scaling a problem faster and cheaper, right? Which actually makes the problem harder to solve, right? Because you've now got more of the problem that exists. And so as good as it is to play around with the tools, you don't want to play around with the tools to scale a problem that already exists. And so this is where we really need to go back to really understanding the problem we're solving. And like some of the best examples I've seen really of practicing love the problem, not the solution, is where some of the organizations we work with using AI to solve the skills mapping challenge, right? Because skills mapping, traditionally has required someone in your team or an external consultant to come in, sit with every head of department, find out what skills they need, find out the target proficiency, and often it sits in an Excel file gathering dust because no one uses the Excel file and it becomes redundant. I mean, that's a problem that AI is really great at solving, which prior technology wasn't as effective at solving. And we've really seen customers use this. And so the takeaway is to be intentional. And by being intentional, it's making sure you start with the problem first, then look at whether it's the right tool. And you really need to be cautious about trying to incorporate AI for the sake of incorporating AI. I mean, the C-suite are not going to give you any brownie points because you used AI to scale the problem.
Yeah, if you think about the last two things we discussed, people can't find information when they need it. And if you think about what people are currently using AI for, it's like, let's just create more content. And you just add into that noise rather than solving a problem. So completely agree. Cool. I want to make sure we get to some of these questions, Nelson, but I just remind people that we'll drop in one final link to download the guide, which gives you the sources for these data points and more practical actions you can take. You can download that for free now. And the second thing is we spoke a bit about who we are, what we do, and the problems we kind of solve for our customers. And if you're interested in knowing more about How Now, there'll be a poll popping up shortly. If you just click yes to that, someone from our team will be in touch. And now it's time for the questions, Nelson. So one would be coming back to the cost of inaction. Is there a way we can calculate that? I don't think we have any stats to hand, which is the second part of the question, but any advice on how we can calculate that cost of inaction?
Yeah, I mean, I can illustrate this with an example, and we kind of dive into a bit more detail around this in our Death of the LMS report, which we can share the link for, which kind of goes into a bit more example around how you can build the business case using cost of inaction. But let's take, for example, a sales team, right? And I've got one of my best sales reps leaves the organization because of a lack of growth. And this seems to be a bit of a trend. Say that's the hypothetical situation we have. Now, the cost of inaction there is now that I don't have that salesperson, the missed opportunity. So what's their quota? And let's say while they were here, they were hitting 80% of their quota. And it's going to take me almost 6 months to find that replacement. Now, that's 6 months of that 80% of the quota we're losing out on. So that's a cost that I'm no longer being able to generate that revenue. Then you also look at what's the cost of hiring a salesperson in a competitive market. There's the recruitment cost, there's the onboarding cost, and you can put a value to each one of those things. Now, quite simply, add up those numbers and you have your cost of inaction. And if the business turns around to you and says, actually, I can't give you budget, and therefore this problem is going to last, let's say, another 6 months, you now add up the costs associated with extending this problem for 6 months and you get your cost of inaction. So at a very high level, they're the metrics we need, right? It really doesn't need to be any more complicated than that to be able to understand the numbers. And if you don't know the cost, then speak to the people who are affected by it. In the example that I gave, you can quite easily speak to the head of sales and understand, okay, what are the metrics at play here? What's the cost to the business as a result of not doing this?
I think another thing to your point earlier as well around the tech you use was doing nothing is a choice as well. So if you know deep down in your heart that a tool you use right now doesn't actually solve the problem for you, then that's part of the cost of inaction as well. The tools you use that are now redundant. And I know because I've done this a million times, because I've deferred having to change which tool I'm using, even though I know it necessarily isn't a good fit anymore. That's the cost of inaction as well, because I continue paying for something I know doesn't solve my problem for however many more months. And then when I change it, I realized that it wasn't that big and scary, and I've saved myself a bunch of time and money anyway. To come back to the ecosystem one, Nelson, we've got a question that in a company of less than 150 employees, how do we go about implementing a single front door? As it's something they're currently looking to do, but obviously if it's a small company overall, it's probably a small L&D team. So what would be your advice there?
Yeah, I think especially as a smaller L&D team, Adam, it's even more important to be able to have a single front door to learning, so you're not stuck having to do the inefficient stuff of finding things for people and pointing people in a particular direction. There's two parts to that. The first part is mapping your ecosystem out, and that just requires you speaking to people in the organization, right? Really understanding where are people going right now to find relevant learning and relevant knowledge. And that will help you identify what the internal sources are. And then you might already be aware of the external sources, right? You might have third-party content libraries, even if you don't have any content. It's empowering your internal experts. Now, this is something not just small companies, even big companies overlook. We're quick to look outside of the organization to capture expertise, but there are internal experts who have previous work experience before they came to your career. Are you really tapping into that and creating a single place for them to capture and share that? So it's really mapping out where does learning and knowledge live within the organization. And I do cover this in a bit more detail in our book, Learning at Speed. Now, the second part is it really is a problem tech will solve for you, right? And look, I'm biased, but you can definitely look out in the market to see who else can help you. But that's exactly what customers use HowNow for. One of the biggest value adds we give our customers that we work with is we integrate with all of your internal tools and systems. We integrate with third-party content libraries. We've also curated hundreds and hundreds of content sources from across the web, and we bring that together into a single searchable place. So you've got a single front door that's an extension of your employer brand. Now, the benefit of a single front door isn't just for the employee who's searching for it. A single front door of learning also means you now have a single source of truth for L&D reporting data. So there is also a benefit for the L&D team and their wider HR team to be able to easily get a complete picture of all of the learning that's happening within the organization. So, really happy to share best practices that we've seen our customers do to be able to achieve this kind of single front door to learning.
Yeah, and to that point, obviously, we've got quite a few questions, so we might go a bit quick fire through these, but feel free to connect with Nelson and myself after this. And if you have any more questions, we'll definitely send over what we have our end. Another one from anonymous attendee, Nelson, but to paraphrase, they're in a company where there was no existence of L&D before, but teams were running their own initiatives. Any recommendations on the steps they can take now there's an L&D team to integrate themselves and make themselves known to other teams? I guess the first nice thing here is that there'll be successes and failures among what those people have done that you can learn from. And also it sounds like you already have advocates for learning in the business. So I'm wondering if is it a simple one or is there more beyond that, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things there, right? The great thing, you don't have any legacy baggage. You're starting from a blank canvas. Now, the first opportunity here is really to be able to define and set your L&D brand, right? You're not just the L&D team. What is your learning brand within the organization? And if you want more on this, we can share some resources around this. And also I cover this in the book, Learning at Speed. But really, that's your opportunity, is to position what are you there to do for the rest of the organization. Now, it's great that you've been having conversations to understand what people have been doing. Now, this is a great opportunity to reduce the friction in the things that they've already been doing that's been working, right? And that's really where you can bring L&D expertise in. What I wouldn't do is to go in and rip up what they've been doing and saying that everything you've been doing is wrong, I know best. That's not the way to get buy-in. And so I would prioritize really kind of reducing the friction in the things they're doing that's working.
It's a nice segue to another question in the chat about speaking to other teams in the business asking them discovery questions. So actually, I'll drop a link to a blog post in the chat, but I spoke to one of our customers who was new to a business about the questions she asked when she first joined, and she gave me this list of 10. So I'll drop that link in the chat. But to summarize the 3 that they've got written down here, Nelson, they're going to ask about current learning challenges, knowledge or skills gaps they see in their team, and what are the team's training priorities for the upcoming year. Is there anything else you'd ask in that discovery process to understand problems to be solved?
Yeah, I mean, I would kind of ask you to reflect on the question of what are your team's current learning challenges, right? Because the teams don't necessarily have learning challenges. Learning is the solution. And I often like the way of looking at this from the lens of jobs to be done. For anyone who's not familiar with the concept, jobs to be done is this idea that when we buy a product, what we're actually doing is we're hiring a product or a service to get a job done, right? And it's really helpful to look at everything we do from the lens of jobs to be done, right? Within an organization, people are basically hiring learning to get a job done. So what you want to understand is, what are the jobs to be done? Is the jobs to be done as a sales rep? I need to be able to deliver a confident and comprehensive sales demo. That's the jobs to be done. Now, what's stopping me from getting that jobs to be done? They're the skills gaps. And I'm basically hiring learning to close those skills gaps. So I would reframe those. The 3 questions to ask is, what skills should this person have? What skills do they actually have? And the third one is, what do I need to prioritize to bridge that gap from a learning perspective? And that's not for them to answer. You don't want the business to tell you what learning to bring in. That's really where we can bring in the expertise to curate the ecosystem and make the relevant learning available to the organization.
Perfect. There's a couple around the idea of the skills mapping and competency mapping, but what I would suggest that people download the guide, because there's a section dedicated to that there, and it's probably more than we can cover in kind of the next couple of minutes. The last one, though, Nelson, will end on, actually, there's a couple. One is how you build positive engagement with an L&D as an L&D team of 1 across the organization without risking burning out from trying to over-engage people.
Yeah, and we've worked with a lot of one-person teams, and I often recommend, rather than looking at yourself as a one-person band, is to look at yourself as the conductor of an orchestra, and the orchestra is your entire organization. Now, the reality is, there's learning that's happening within your business with or without you. But like we spoke about earlier, what L&D can really do is help reduce the friction for people to learn in the flow of work. And so to build that positive engagement is to start to do that, is to essentially, rather than thinking you have to create the content, you have to bring in the expertise, you have to do every part of the job to be done, is to actually lean and make the wider organization collaborative. Because if you're using the language of skills, they will be bought in to addressing those skills gaps. The other part of building a positive engagement is really marketing, right? Is, how often do you play back the success stories? And the success stories don't have to be big org-wide. If you've worked with one particular team and helped them improve their performance, and you can get that data, even if it's qualitative, anecdotal data that the head of the department has shared with you, what are you doing to share that with the rest of the business? Are you sharing that on your company's LinkedIn profile? Are you marketing the success stories? Now, every successful product is effective at talking about the success stories of people who use that product. But often L&D overlook the importance of social proof and success story. So that's a really great way to build that positive association with L&D.
And also, I guess, to your point earlier, Nelson, around the internal experts, the people are already creating, those people are already engaged to some extent. So if you start with those people and natural advocates, the worry of kind of burning people out or over-engaging them about learning, these are people who are already passionate about it that other people would turn into. So like a quick one would be people who are sharing in Slack, I just figured out how to do this. Here's the top level summary. Or other people ask in Slack, like, hey, how do I do this? These are the people, I guess, you can help build that wider team without worrying that you're going to just be a bit of a burden to them because they're already exhibiting the behaviors anyway, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, another example of kind of leveraging existing content is basically, rather than creating content from scratch, is, like I said, content is cheap and abundant. Find and curate relevant content. then get people from within the business to add the context that makes that content relevant to your particular organization, right? It's a great way of scaling to make sure you have learning resources to support every need in the business.
Perfect. And let's end on last one. Following on from the COI chat, in the chat saying, unfortunately, their company is still asking around ROI and their team are having trouble demonstrating that. I guess it comes back a bit to what you said at the start, is around aligning with the right business metrics, because if you're aligned with business metrics, then it's far easier, I guess, to demonstrate a return on the training in terms of not just the course completion, but how it influenced business metrics. But any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, a kind of quick one of how to demonstrate the ROI is essentially you want to connect the spend directly to the skills that you've developed in the organization. Now, you do need the right tech stack to be able to connect those dots and to be able to track and measure skills. But if you don't, at the very least, what you should be doing is getting the quantitative data to demonstrate that you've had an impact. So let's just take sales conversion rate. You want to improve sales conversion rate for the business. You need to know what the baseline metric was. So what is it today? Maybe it's 10% today, and the goal is to get to 20%. So you now have a start point and a finish point to demonstrate the journey that you've gone on. Now, the question you might ask me is, well, Nelson, just because the conversion rate got better doesn't mean learning had an effect. Now, that's where qualitative data comes in, where you interview the people in the sales team, you interview the sales leader, you interview customers, and you ask them, what helped you change the way you were selling? And if they start to reference the learning experiences that they engaged with, that anecdotal evidence is sufficient for you to be able to combine the quantitative and qualitative data to build an impact narrative that demonstrates to the business going, look, the reason why we got this is because actually learning influenced their behavior change. And that's all the business is looking for, is some way to demonstrate that your work has influenced a business metric.
It links back to what you said before as well. There's people who can tell great stories from a personal perspective as well. So don't just get lost in the numbers or the data, I guess. Nelson, we are beyond time. So I want to thank you for staying on for a few extra minutes to answer those questions. And thank you everyone who joined us today.